Peter Hall stood outside the classroom door with his hand shaking on the metal knob because his dog, Ruby, stopped dead in the middle of the empty hallway and refused to take another step, letting out a sound that wasn't a bark but a high-pitched scream trapped in her throat. And Peter knew instantly that the smell coming from under the door of room 3B wasn't floor wax or chalk dust. It was the chemical smell of a terrified child sweating through her clothes. Grab your coffee and stay with me, so you can understand why a police officer was standing in an elementary school hallway with tears in his eyes instead of being on patrol. The day had started wrong from the moment the alarm clock went off because the house was too quiet. Peter had been raising his 10-year-old daughter Olivia by himself for 3 years now, ever since his wife Sarah died in the car accident that also took Olivia's right leg. Peter usually woke up to the sound of Olivia moving around in her room or thumping her crutches on the floor, but this morning there was nothing. When he went into the kitchen to start the coffee, he found Olivia sitting at the small round table in the dark, still wearing her pajamas, staring at her prosthetic leg like it was a monster that was going to bite her. He asked her what was wrong as he put a piece of toast in the toaster, trying to keep his voice cheerful because he knew she fed off his energy. Olivia didn't look up at him. She just kept picking at her fingernails until they were red and sore. She told him she didn't want to go to school because her stomach hurt, but she didn't look sick. She looked tired and defeated. Hi, my amazing friends and family. Welcome back to Vigilant Heart Tales. Before we jump deep into today's story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing all your names and countries. And don't forget to check out the other stories on the channel. Tomorrow I've got another crazy one coming that I know you'll enjoy. Alright, let's get into it. Peter felt that familiar stab of guilt that every single parent feels when they have to choose between their job and their child's comfort. He sat down next to her and rubbed her back, feeling how tense her small shoulders were. He told her that she had to go because he had mandatory K-9 training with Ruby and he couldn't miss it, but he promised that if she still felt bad by lunch, he would come and get her. Olivia didn't argue or cry, which was almost worse. She just nodded slowly and pulled her hood up over her head as if she was trying to hide from the world. He drove her to Lincoln Elementary in his truck with Ruby in the back seat. Ruby was usually excited to see Olivia, but even the dog seemed off that morning, pacing back and forth on the seat and nudging Olivia's arm with her wet nose over and over again. When they pulled up to the red brick school, Peter looked at the building and felt a sense of relief because everyone in town told him how lucky he was to have Olivia in Mrs. Lewis's class. Mrs. Lewis was the teacher of the year, a woman who had been teaching for 30 years and was known for her strict discipline and high test scores. The principal had told Peter that Mrs. Lewis was exactly what Olivia needed to get back on track after the accident, because she didn't tolerate excuses and she would push Olivia to be normal. Peter watched his daughter walk toward the school entrance, her backpack looking too big for her, and he saw her hesitate at the doors before pushing them open and disappearing inside. Peter went to work, but he couldn't focus on anything. He was at the training facility with the other K-9 units, running Ruby through scent detection drills, but his mind kept drifting back to the look on Olivia's face at the breakfast table. Ruby was distracted too, missing commands she knew by heart and constantly looking back at the truck as if she wanted to leave. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Peter couldn't take it anymore because the knot in his stomach had turned into a physical pain. He called his sergeant and told him he had a family emergency. Then he loaded Ruby into the back of his cruiser and drove straight to the school. He didn't call ahead because he told himself he just wanted to surprise her with an early pickup and maybe take her for ice cream to make up for the rough morning. When he walked into the school, the secretary wasn't at her desk, so Peter just signed the visitor log and buzzed himself through the security doors using his police access code. The school was strangely quiet for the middle of the afternoon, with no sounds of teachers lecturing or kids laughing in the hallways. As he walked down the long corridor toward the third grade wing, Ruby started to pull on her leash. She wasn't pulling like she was tracking a suspect. She was pulling like she was scared. She dragged Peter past the library and the gym, her claws scrambling on the waxed floor, until they reached the door to room 3B. That was when she stopped dead in her tracks and let out that high, desperate whine. Peter looked at the door and noticed that the blinds on the small window were pulled all the way down, blocking any view inside, which he knew was against school safety regulations. He leaned closer to the door and listened. He heard a voice that he recognized as Mrs. Lewis, but it didn't sound like the sweet, grandmotherly voice she used during parent-teacher conferences. It sounded sharp and cold and cruel. She was saying something about balance and how crying was for babies. Then Peter heard a thud, like something heavy hitting the floor, followed by a small, stifled sob that he knew belonged to his daughter. Peter didn't think about the rules or the law or his job. He just reacted as a father. He stepped back and kicked the door right next to the lock, snapping the wood and swinging the door open with a loud crash. He stepped into the room with Ruby right beside him, and the scene that was waiting for them was so horrific that for a second, his brain couldn't even process what he was seeing. The classroom was dim and hot, smelling of sweat and chalk. All the children were sitting at their desks with their heads down, terrified to look up. In the front of the room, Mrs. Lewis was standing over Olivia with a heavy wooden ruler raised in her hand like a weapon. But the worst part, the part that made Peter's knees almost give out, was that Olivia was not wearing her prosthetic leg. The artificial limb was lying on the floor in the corner of the room, far out of her reach. Olivia was balancing on her one good leg, her arms shaking violently as she tried to stay upright, tears streaming down her red face. She looked like she had been standing there for a long time, pushed to the point of total physical collapse. Mrs. Lewis spun around when the door crashed open, her face twisting from anger to shock when she saw the police uniform. Ruby didn't wait for Peter to give a command. She rushed forward and placed herself between the teacher and Olivia, letting out a deep, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Peter walked into the room, his eyes locked on his daughter, and he saw the absolute terror in her eyes melt into relief when she saw him. She didn't say a word, she just let go of the desk she was holding and collapsed, her little body hitting the floor because she didn't have the strength to stand for one more second. Peter fell to his knees and scooped her up, holding her tightly against his chest, and he felt her heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked up at the teacher, who was now backing away with her hands raised, and he felt a rage so hot and pure that it scared him more than anything he had ever faced on the street. He realized then that the silence in the hallway hadn't been peace. It had been the silence of children who were too scared to scream. Peter dropped to his knees on the hard linoleum floor, and he didn't care about the pain in his bad leg or the fact that he was tearing his uniform pants because all he could see was his daughter collapsing like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He caught her just before her head hit the ground and pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her sweaty hair while she grabbed onto his tactical vest with fingers that were white from gripping the desk for so long. She wasn't screaming anymore, but she was making a small, hitching sound in her throat that was worse than screaming because it was the sound of a child who had been trying to be brave for too long and finally broke. Ruby was right there with them, pressing her wet nose against Olivia's cheek and licking away the salty tears, offering the kind of pure comfort that only a dog can give. Peter looked up from his daughter and saw Mrs. Lewis standing by the whiteboard with her mouth open and her face pale, the wooden ruler lying on the floor where she had dropped it when the door smashed open. The teacher looked at the police dog and then at Peter's face, and for the first time, the arrogance in her eyes flickered and died. Peter didn't yell right away because he was too busy checking Olivia to make sure she wasn't injured, running his hands over her arms and checking her eyes, but then he saw the red marks on her palms where she had been pressing them into the desk to hold her weight up. Olivia looked up at him with eyes that were swollen and red and whispered that she was sorry. She whispered that she didn't fall and she tried to be good so she wouldn't lose her recess points. That apology broke something inside Peter, snapping the last bit of patience he had, because no child should ever have to apologize for not being able to stand on one leg when they only have one leg to stand on. He stood up slowly, lifting Olivia effortlessly into his arms because she felt terrifyingly light, and he turned to face the woman who was supposed to be protecting her. Mrs. Lewis took a step back and tried to fix her cardigan, putting on a mask of professional concern as she told Peter that he was overreacting and that Olivia was having a behavioral episode. She said that Olivia had been kicking her desk with her prosthetic leg and disrupting the other students, so she had simply removed the distraction to help Olivia focus. Peter stared at her and asked her if she really thought taking a disabled child's leg was a modification technique or if she was just cruel, and Mrs. Lewis narrowed her eyes and told him that he didn't understand how to raise a special needs child because he was too soft. She said Olivia needed to learn that the world wouldn't coddle her and that she was teaching her stamina, but Peter cut her off and told her to stop talking before he arrested her for assault right there in front of the class. The room was deadly silent, 20 other children watching with wide, terrified eyes, and Peter realized that none of them had moved or spoken the entire time because they were just as scared of her as Olivia was. Mrs. Lewis crossed her arms and told Peter that he had no proof of anything and that the school board would back her up because she had 30 years of perfect evaluations and he was just an emotional single father who couldn't handle his daughter's problems. She smiled a thin, nasty smile that said she knew she was going to get away with it, and Peter felt a surge of panic because he knew she was right. He knew that without proof it would be his word against a pillar of the community. But then he heard a squeak of sneakers on the floor from the back of the room. A small boy with messy hair and glasses was standing up behind his desk, his hands shaking so hard that they were vibrating. Peter recognized him as Leo, the quiet kid who always sat in the back and drew in his notebook during drop-off. Mrs. Lewis snapped at Leo to sit down immediately and threatened to call his parents, but Leo didn't sit down. He looked at Mrs. Lewis and then he looked at Olivia crying in Peter's arms, and he made a choice. He picked up a black composition notebook from his desk and walked to the front of the room, his head down but his feet moving steadily. He walked right past the teacher, dodging her hand when she tried to grab his arm, and he stopped in front of Peter. He didn't say a word, he just held out the notebook. Peter shifted Olivia to his left hip and took the book with his right hand, flipping it open to the page Leo had marked with his thumb. It wasn't schoolwork inside. It was a drawing. It was a crude pencil sketch, but it was detailed enough to make Peter's stomach turn. It showed a woman with a mean face holding a stick, standing over a girl who was crying on the floor without her leg. Underneath the drawing, in shaky block letters, Leo had written, "She takes the leg when we are bad." Peter flipped the page and saw another drawing of a boy standing in the corner with his hands on his head, and another of the teacher throwing a book. It was a diary of torture, a visual record of every mean thing she had done when the door was closed and the blinds were down. Peter turned the notebook around and held it up so Mrs. Lewis could see it, and the color drained out of her face completely. She started to stammer, saying that Leo was a troubled child with an active imagination and that those were just doodles, but Peter shook his head and told her that it looked like evidence to him. Leo looked up at Peter and whispered that she locks the door so nobody can hear, and that she told them the police would take their mommies and daddies away if they ever told what happened in room 3B. That was the final straw. Peter reached for his radio on his shoulder and called dispatch, requesting a supervisor and an ambulance immediately. The sound of the police radio crackling to life broke the spell in the room. Another little girl stood up in the front row and walked over to the corner where Mrs. Lewis had thrown Olivia's prosthetic leg. She picked it up with both hands like it was something precious and brought it over to Peter, telling him that she hated Mrs. Lewis because she was mean. Then another boy stood up, and another, until the whole class was standing, their fear replaced by the realization that the monster wasn't invincible. Mrs. Lewis collapsed into her chair and started to cry, playing the victim, but nobody was buying it anymore. Ruby stood guard between the teacher and the kids, watching her with unblinking amber eyes, daring her to move. When the principal burst into the room a few minutes later with 2 other teachers, he stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the scene. He tried to ask what was happening, but Peter cut him off and told him to look at the notebook. The principal looked at the drawings and then at his star teacher, and he looked like he was going to be sick. He tried to apologize to Peter, stammering about how he didn't know and how the test scores were so high. But Peter just looked at him with cold eyes and told him that he didn't know because he never bothered to look inside the room. The paramedics arrived and took Olivia from Peter's arms to check her leg, which was swollen and red from the strain of balancing for so long. Peter walked outside with them, leaving the other officers to handle Mrs. Lewis. He sat on the back bumper of the ambulance while the EMTs gave Olivia some water and a juice box. She was quiet, but she wasn't shaking anymore. She watched as 2 officers escorted Mrs. Lewis out of the school building in handcuffs, her head hanging low, no longer the queen of the school. Leo walked out a few minutes later holding his mother's hand, and Peter made sure to wave at him. Leo gave a small, shy smile back, the first time Peter had ever seen the kid smile. Peter turned to Olivia and brushed the hair out of her face, telling her that he was proud of her and that she was the bravest girl he knew. Olivia took a sip of her juice and looked down at Ruby, who was lying on the pavement at her feet, chewing on a stick she had found in the grass. Olivia said that Ruby knew the teacher was bad even before they went inside, and Peter nodded, pulling his daughter close and kissing the top of her head. He told her that dogs always know, and that from now on, he was going to listen to them. They sat there for a long time, just the 3 of them, watching the flashing lights and feeling the cold air. But for the first time in a long time, Peter didn't feel the heavy weight of guilt in his chest. He felt light, because he knew that the secret was out, the monster was gone, and he had saved his world. He promised Olivia that she never had to go back to that room again, and she leaned her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes, finally safe. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you enjoyed this story, I promise you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more thrilling as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.